Hello, vinyl community. This is Tommy in North Carolina, and I want to do a video of something that's kind of been on my mind the last couple of days, and wanted to share it with you guys, and maybe get some thoughts and comments. What I'd like to talk about right now are late period albums that are surprisingly good, or maybe albums that are better than they should be. And what I'm talking about is bands or artists from the 60s or had their heyday in the 60s and 70s, and they've released material in the last few years that has been really good and up to par with probably their 60s material. For example, just to start off, and I don't have this on vinyl, perhaps the later Steely Dan work that came out, the last couple of records, Two Against Nature. Those records, I think, were regarded, Everything Must Go, I think, is the other one. Those records were kind of widely regarded as really good Steely Dan albums, and were as good as the material from the 70s. And there's probably a couple of other ones that I'm thinking of. Another one I could think of recently that came out in the last few years was the Cars album, the Cars reunion album, not the one that they did with Todd Rundgren, the live album, the actual studio album they did with Rick Ocasek. And I don't have that on vinyl. It's called Move Like This, I believe. That was a really decent album, and if you like the Cars, which I do, that album kind of lived up to its standards. So using those as sort of examples, and maybe you kind of following what I mean, I'm going to highlight a few that I kind of picked out of my collection that I wanted to talk about as sort of surprising late albums. This one is one that came out last year for the 50th anniversary for the Monkees. It's called Good Times. Now, this album is interesting because, for all intents and purposes, the Monkees shouldn't be doing new albums, and their career kind of they kind of just keep coming back. The Monkees do. Well, in celebration of their 50th anniversary, 2016, from 1966 is when the show and the group debuted on television. They did this album, and this album was actually quite surprising, especially for fans of the Monkees, but of music fans in general. It featured songwriting by people like Rivers Cuomo from Weezer, and also Ben Gibbard from Death Cab for Cutie wrote an excellent song that Michael Nesmith and Mickey Dolenz sings. It features work by all four Monkees. They used Davy Jones' vocal track and did some updates to it. And the album was produced by Adam Schlesinger, as some of you probably know from Fountains of Wayne. He also was one of the writers of the hit That Thing You Do, the Tom Hanks movie. So he has a real sensibility for this kind of stuff. Andy Partridge from XTC has a song on here. In addition to Michael Nesmith and Peter Tork, they also have materials represented. It's not really a group effort, but the Monkees never really were. And so this album, Good Times, kind of holds up with their sort of post-1967 work, kind of when they took more creative control over their musical output. Albums like Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn and Jones, those types of albums. This is kind of in that vein of that kind of album. Good songwriters, good producers. But the album itself, it has a definite sort of 60s throwback feel to it. But it's an enjoyable listen. The songs are all really, really decent, and they hold up well. I listened to this the other day again, and it does do really well. There's also a Record Store Day companion, Good Times Plus, which was kind of a 4-song EP collection of the B-sides that were left over from this. But, I mean, for the Monkees to do an album 50 years after their debut and for it to be decent is quite surprising, because there's no reason that they should have made an album this good, but they did. And so this kind of is one of the first ones that came to my mind in terms of albums, late period albums that are better than they should be. Another one that came to mind was Brian Wilson's That Lucky Old Son. Now, this is interesting because Brian, in the late 90s, sort of when he married Melinda and kind of got his career back and was able to take a little more control and start touring again and things like that, it was quite interesting because we've seen Brian in the last few years kind of come a little bit more out of his shell with a great backing band, and he's just kind of come into his own here in the last 10, 15 years. And so in 2004, he finally completed the Smile project, which was a great burden that was lifted off of his shoulder, I'm sure. And he followed Smile up with a weird album that that I think was a lot of leftover stuff from earlier projects. But then he got into this, which is kind of a song cycle. And it features a few lyrics by Van Dyke Park, so there's a little bit of that. But he did this with Scott Bennett, I believe, who is in his band. And Brian does really well with collaborators, and usually with his band members. But this album is a really nice record. It's got a classic Brian Wilson sound, and it holds up. It's a good listen, and to me, it's on par with the best stuff that he did with the Beach Boys. Brian Wilson's solo stuff can be really spotty at best. I love Brian. I love what he does, but this album was a genuine surprise because it really, as an album, song for song, it holds up very, very well. Like I said, it's a song cycle featuring the classic "That Lucky Old Sun." And it kind of goes through California life. I mean, the cover kind of gives it away with the oranges, but it basically is a love letter to Southern California. And so the songs kind of deal with that. There's a few narratives on there. Like I said, Van Dyke Parks, I think, wrote some of those words. But as an album, it's very good, and it's surprisingly better than anything. And I might say it's Brian Wilson's best solo album, excluding the Smile stuff he did in '04, which, I mean, that stuff's a triumph anyway. And so this leads me to my last one here. I'm going to talk about ELO, Electric Light Orchestra. This is an album that came out in 2001. It's called Zoom. And from what I understand, when Jeff Lynne kind of broke ELO up, Bev Bevan, the drummer, who was the original member of the band, he kind of had the name, and they split the rights to the name ELO between Jeff Lynne and Bev Bevan. And Bev Bevan went out and toured as ELO 2, which was a different version of ELO. Jeff Lynne had nothing to do with ELO 2. And Jeff Lynne went on to have great solo success as a producer and writer. He worked with the Traveling Wilburys, and more recently Tom Petty. Free Fallin', those songs were all produced and co-written with Jeff, and he was a big part of particularly early 90s radio. If you were listening to a rock station, you probably heard some Jeff Lynne stuff. Roy Orbison's You Got It. Jeff Lynne's fingerprints were all over pop radio from about 1986 all the way till about 1991. Well, flash forward to 2001. I think Bev Bevan finally gave the name ELO back to Jeff Lynne or signed the rights back over. Either way, Jeff Lynne did this album called Zoom, and it's pretty much a Jeff Lynne solo album. I think he pretty much plays most of the instruments. Now, there's some guest appearances by some people like George Harrison, Ringo Starr, people like that show up on this album. But for all intents and purposes, this really is a Jeff Lynne solo album. The album did not sell well at all. It tanked, but as an ELO album, it's really good. It's much better than people give it credit for, and so you should give it a second chance. But that leads us to last year when Jeff Lynne actually did a full-blown Jeff Lynne's ELO album called Alone in the Universe, and this is a really, really good album. It's better than Zoom. But I mean, if you like ELO, if you love those classic ELO albums like Out of the Blue and Face the Music and those sort of mid-'70s period ELO albums, this is definitely on course. I'm a big fan of Jeff singing as well as his songwriting and arranging. So as a Jeff Lynne nut, I naturally kind of dig this album. And he doesn't release a lot of music on a regular basis, so it's always nice to hear from Jeff. And hopefully, if Jeff is watching this video, which I know he is, tour the United States, please. I know me and my friend Sean in New Orleans. Hi, Sean. We'd love to go see Jeff Lynne, so please do it. I mean, it would be a dream come true. But these are some later period albums that kind of came to mind as far as surprisingly good or better than they should be. I know The Who did a record about 10, 12 years ago, Endless Wire. anytime you get artists or bands that do things that, especially ones that aren't very prolific, people like Elvis Costello, who releases music constantly. They've not really gone away. Elton John is constantly doing new stuff. So it's hard to lump people like that into a category like that. But when you have people that are kind of rare with what they're doing, I mean, no one would have expected Brian Wilson to record an album like That Lucky Old Son at that point in his career. I mean, he can pretty much go on cruise control, throw some harmonies on stuff, and people are going to like it. People like me. But that album actually artistically to me, it holds up. So those are some late period albums. I know there's probably some that I'm missing. If so, comment below. Like this video. Like I said, comment. I try to interact with as much of you. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter. It's TommyBurton75. And you can go there, and I usually will show what I'm spinning on those feeds. So thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. My subscriber base is starting to grow a little bit, and I really appreciate you guys for doing that and spread the word. I hope you like what I'm doing. And let me know if there's something like an idea that you'd like for me to talk about. I always have things rattling around, but like I said, this was one that kind of came up recently, and I wanted to share it with you. In the meantime, you guys have a good rest of the week and have a great night. Thanks for watching.